Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to season 9 of the Podcast Babes podcast. My name is Anna Klasse, host of this pod and founder of the Podcast Babes. Every week, I interview and inspire a female podcaster here who has made her podcast work for her and her business. So tune in to learn from her mistakes, create your own profitable podcast. Here's today's episode. Hey Podcast Babes, welcome back. Today I'm here with Andréa Jones. She is the social media strategist who helps you find the sweet spot between hustle and soft life. I'm definitely interested. She is also the host of the award-winning Mindful Marketing podcast, where she shares the latest social media tips and strategies. And I'm so excited to have you on the show here today, Andrea. Just to hear your tips and tricks on podcasting, but maybe also a little bit on social media, because I know that some people who might be listening today are not necessarily the biggest fan of social media sometimes. So I want to hear all of your best advice, how to make it work for us. So first of all, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Honestly, I love geeking out about both podcasting and social media. So I'm happy to be here and just like chat about it.
Then you're in the right place. I have so many questions for you.
Of course.
Maybe to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do as a social media strategist and then also how a podcast fits into that?
Yes. So I started my business in 2014, but I have been playing online, creating content online since 2004. And it was definitely not cool to have a blog in 2004. Everyone was like, "Yeah, nerd." But I loved it. And so in 2014, I started the business as a freelancer. So the past 10 years kind of built it up into a social media agency. I actually just recently sold my agency. And now I'm
Oh,
just a social media educator and content creator. Um, and how the podcast fits into all of that is I come from a YouTube background. So the weird thing is I met my husband on YouTube. We're both creating YouTube videos. We were in the comment section commenting, and then we created a video together, kind of like we're doing this interview. And then we just kept talking after.
oh my
But I
God.
come from the YouTube space. Yeah, it's like social media is in like literally my life. um, but when I started my business, I stopped creating content because I was so focused on just running the business. Couple years in, I realized that I got bit by the content bug again and actually happened to have a lot of clients who had podcasts. And so I started off just managing social media accounts for podcasters and then was like, podcasting seems way easier than doing a YouTube video because I could just record the audio piece and not worry about the video piece. So I did this 28-day challenge that podcast movement was running. And it was like if you did their free challenge, then you could win a ticket to go to the conference. And so I did it and I happened to win. And so I got to go to the conference for free. And that just like opened up my whole world into podcasting. Like I didn't realize how much of an impact it would have on my business. It's the most consistent like content creation thing I've ever done. And that was 2018. So I started podcasting in 2018 and I haven't stopped since.
Cool. That's awesome. That's so cool. I love how you took that challenge and then also won. That's so cool. But even if you didn't win the ticket, I think, completing a 28-day challenge and then walking away from that challenge with a podcast, I mean, there's no losing, right? There's like everyone's a winner who goes through that. So I think that's super cool that you saw that opportunity and then you took it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would have launched the way that I did if I didn't go through that challenge because it was broken down into such small pieces. And I have no idea if they still do this, but it's broken down into such small pieces like choose the name of your show. Today we're going to design the artwork. Then the next day we're going to write the description. And so it was like so bite sized that I actually got through it all. And as you know, with podcasting, there's so many like little pieces to, like, check off before you can even, like, publish a show. Whereas I found with the YouTube channel, it was different because when you created the thing and then uploaded the thing, and there wasn't really a lot that you had to do, to like get it out there. With podcasting, it was a little bit different. So yeah, the challenge in and of itself was a huge accomplishment for me.
Yeah, I love that, and I think it's so important to have those that guidance, right? Because like you said, podcasts and especially launching a new podcast has so many moving pieces. I remember when I launched my first podcast, I just got lost because I started and I was like, okay, I think I know what to do. And then, oh, well, there's this other thing and this other thing. Oh, yeah. And I didn't think about this. And, like all of those things like keep coming up. So I think having some sort of guidance or structure for creating your podcast and then launching it, I think is just really, really valuable, whether that's working with company to help you or with a podcast manager or with a challenge like this, like some kind of structure, I think there's probably no way to launch a podcast without it.
Yeah.
So then after launching, going to the conference, you said that your podcast has this really good impact on your business. Was that immediately that you saw, oh my God, this is working? Or was it kind of a slow start? Can you share a little bit more about what that looked like exactly for you?
Yeah. I saw this pretty immediate success. So I think because the podcast is so focused on social media, and at the time, this was 2018. So at the time, there wasn't a ton of other podcasts in this niche.
Okay.
And if there were, they were kind of speaking to like bigger brands. And a lot of my podcast speaks to like small businesses, entrepreneurs, one person businesses, like we're doing all of the things. And so I found like this space for myself in that area that not a lot of other people were doing. So the 20 episodes in, I got my first sponsor for the podcast. And it was a pretty, for me, significant deal. It was $1,000 a month, and they had full sponsorship of the show, like full run of the show. And I had that sponsor for 3 years into
Wow.
like run. Yeah. So it was like a really long term partnership for me, and that covered the cost of producing the show. So I saw pretty immediate success in that regard. But the other thing, and I don't know if you find this too with your show, is I got to talk to people and like pick their brain, people who I would have never had the opportunity to talk to them before. Like if
Yeah.
I just said to someone, like, "Hey, let's sit down and have a coffee chat," they'd be like, busy." But I'm like, "Hey, can you come on my podcast?" Same conversation. It's just
Yeah.
in a different format. And it was like I was talking to people who I felt were out of my league a little bit, and that's because of the podcast. So for me, those 2 things instantly, I was like, "Oh, this is so worth it."
Yeah, it's such a good excuse to talk to cool people
Yeah.
and get all their tips and tricks. It's so good.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
It's
And
just that
it's like,
excuse.
I know we're recording it, but also, like, can I be nosy about how you run your business, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You're just getting yourself that pass to ask just any question you want, and people will answer it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, pretty
I love
instant
that.
success, yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. How did you find this sponsor, or did they find you?
They found me on LinkedIn. So I was just doing my social media thing, right? So I record the podcast, but then I share it out everywhere on, like, all of my social channels, and, the marketing director at the company found the podcast on LinkedIn and then sent me a message and was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about sponsors?" I was like, "No, what's your budget?" Like trying to be like try not to create a package, but let's see how much they can afford and what they want. And honestly, it turned into more than just a podcast. But it all started from them sliding into my DMs on LinkedIn.
Very cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Is there any advice that you would give new podcasters when they think about working with a sponsor? Like working with them for 3 years, but then also I believe now you also have a sponsor on the podcast, right?
Yeah.
So having some experience in this, I know that many podcasters they just have no idea and you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So what would your top tips be for newer podcasters?
Yeah. I think the hardest thing about sponsorship is the tracking.
Mhm.
So with a YouTube video, the link is in the description. Everyone knows this link in the description. You go to the description, you click the link, and you go there. With a podcast, people are not sitting down and watching it like a YouTube video. They're like, doing their dishes, walking the dog, taking the kids to daycare. So there's not really a like, of course, you put the links in the show notes, but a lot of people don't click the links. So the thing that I found over the years is to have coupon codes with my sponsors so that, people need to hear that ad probably like 7, 10, 12 times before they go, "Oh, yeah, I need to go check this out and put in the coupon code." They may never click the link in the show notes because, like, they're listening and they're gone, but they may remember, like, there's a coupon code to put that in. So that's been the biggest way to track it for me. But as far as getting sponsors, in between having sponsors, so I had that sponsor for, 3 years, and then I had a gap. I was sponsoring my own show. So I would use my own products, my own offers to sponsor my show, and I think even if you don't have a sponsor, you can use your own stuff, or if you're an affiliate for something, you can use that too.
Mhm,
So a great example of a sponsor that I have now, who I never had before, was Canva. I've been trying to get Canva as a sponsor for years, and I'm a Canva ambassador this year for the first time. But before doing that, I would just name drop them all the time and be like, click my link in the show notes. That's my affiliate link. I was not affiliated with them like as a partner, but I would get revenue from the affiliate link. So you can
mhm.
even do things like that too, where it's like not an official partnership, but if you sign up for their affiliate program and someone clicks your link, you can still get, like, residual revenue that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the guests that we have on this podcast, they monetize their podcast a little bit differently. They don't necessarily have sponsors, but they often use their podcast to market their own business and get clients from their podcast. Is that also something that you do, and do you see that work for your business as well? And how do you see that like relate to the sponsorship? Like do you have a balance, like a conscious balance in that, or does it just work itself out? Can you talk a little bit more about that, what that looks
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, so when I ran my agency, I would say anecdotally, probably like 75% of the clients would listen to at least one episode of the podcast before
Mhm,
becoming a client. And I distinctly remember, Rachel Rogers, when she became a client, um, she got on the call with me and her team got on the call with me to see if we'd be a good fit, and they were quoting back something I said in a podcast episode on,
that's
like,
cool.
the sales call to see and I'm like, "Oh, you studied." Like, they
Yeah.
went deep into my world, and so, for me, it's such an intimate medium, right? Like, when someone listens to a podcast, you're, like, in their head. You're, like, literally AirPods in their head. So for me, a lot of people who sign up for my programs, become a private client, they're listened to at least one episode so they can get a sense of my vibe. And so I like to think of the podcast as a sample of what it's like to work with me because I'm not like super buttoned up or, I use not a lot of analogies. I like to tell stories, things like that. And so that's very much how my teaching style is. It's very much how it is to work with me. And so, yes, I definitely get clients from the podcast. I've even had people who I've interviewed who have then become a client as well. Or they book me for speaking gigs and things like that. And so it's so integral into everything I do, and it's actually the one thing I don't skip. Like, sometimes I'll take a break from social media. Sometimes I'll take a break from writing my newsletter. I don't skip publishing a podcast episode. Like, it's just such a deep part of how I market myself that it's that important. Like, it's the last bit. Like, if I skip a podcast episode, I'm, like, laid out sick in the hospital somewhere. Like, I don't skip, and I've had 2 babies since that, and didn't skip an episode during any of that. So, yes, the podcast for me is how I get clients. It's like the middle of my funnel as far as, nurturing
Mhm.
relationships with potential clients and customers.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so cool that you were able to stay so consistent even through, like, I think I love it that you mentioned that you had 2 babies, like, in running this podcast and hosting this podcast, and you still consistently release content and that that was possible. Can you share a little bit more about how you do that? How can
Yeah.
you stay so consistent for 6 years?
Yeah. Um, I will admit the having the babies part was the hardest. Not necessarily after the baby came, but, like, during both pregnancies, and I had 2 babies in 3 years. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-month-old. So,
Wow.
very back to back. I don't recommend it that way, just happened that way. Um, it was like, the pregnancy was so hard, especially being pregnant and having a toddler. Like, my energy level was non-existent most
Mhm,
days. So, I batch recorded when I could. Some weeks I would record podcast episodes every single day, that week to catch up, especially during the 2nd trimester, like, energy boost where it's like, "Oh, I feel halfway normal again. We're just gonna record a bunch of podcasts." I also found the interviews to be easier than, just episodes with me because I could just ask questions and then
mhm,
breathe a little bit. And then I have support. I have a team. So my assistant is wonderful. She helps me edit my podcast. She makes sure everything's organized with the guests and they all get their assets afterwards so they can share the episodes and all of that. So um, that really helped with both of those pregnancies. But during both, I stopped posting YouTube videos. I really slowed down my social, like, I slowed down everything else so that I could just focus in on the podcast. The other thing
mhm.
I'll say too is I have really streamlined it over the years. So when I
Oh,
first started the podcast, I would do all these editing things that I just don't do anymore because I found that the raw podcast is 80% there anyways. And like I could spend another 3 hours to get it to 90%, or I could just run it at a B. Like it's good. It's great. And so yeah, I stopped getting so worried about it being perfect,
mhm,
and just would the front end research for me is the most important piece. So, like, researching my guests, researching the topic, creating my outline, that part I've gotta do. But then when I sit down to record and then even editing after, I just don't spend a lot of time overthinking that piece. So that also really helps, if I have to do a bunch of episodes at once.
yeah, absolutely. So what I'm hearing you say is it's having those processes in place. So you have your team to support you. You let go of the perfectionism. And then also the first thing that you said, I would probably say that's just prioritizing it, right? Over everything else, you wanted to stay consistent with this podcast. So that meant batch recording when you could, letting go of some other marketing strategies or marketing projects so that you could focus on the podcast. And then, yeah, just doing the thing, batch recording when you could and getting that to your team on time so that you could stay consistent that way. That's awesome. That's really cool. And that must have been challenging, but it must also feel so good that now, you can say, yes, made it, stayed consistent all the time.
Yeah, it does feel good to be on the other side of it. There are no more kids for me, so I'm happy about that too. Um, but, it's just one of those things too where I use the resources that I had available to me. So, for example, December is a really hard month to produce content for me. It's like the end of the year scramble to like get everything done before holiday stuff and then add in like all the holiday stuff. And I'm like, where is time? So in December, the past 2 years, I've published podcasts, that I was a guest on my own feed. So I'd reach out to a few people and be like, "Hey, I really like this interview. Can I republish it on my podcast?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure, absolutely." And I just record like a little intro piece, be like, "Hey, this is this interview from whatever." And so like there's so much available to us that we have as content, and so I would just try to be as creative as possible to, like, create this content piece and not just have to start from scratch every time.
Yeah, I think that is a really creative way to do it. And there's so many different formats that you can play with actually in podcasting, right? I think, so everyone always thinks solo episodes, interviews, okay, well, that's it. But there's so much more that you can do, like republishing the other side of the story. So where you're the guest, like you mentioned, but also, like some of my clients were like panel discussions or I don't know, they ask the same guest on again. I've done that for my podcast, which has been super fun, where you can kind of like catch up, like, okay, what's new?
Yeah.
And then refer back to the last interview as well. So there's some like hacks, I would say, to make life easier when you need it for sure. I also know that the podcast looks different than what it looked when you launched it, right? Because at some point you also went through a rebrand. How was that?
Yeah. Challenging. I don't recommend it. No. It's like
Okay.
it's so hard. Like, so I did the rebrand 6 months ago now, so it's still very new to me. The podcast started off as the Savvy Social podcast, and it matches the branding of a lot of my products. So I have the Savvy Social School, which is my membership. I have Savvy Social Pro, which is my mentorship for, like, professionals.
Mhm.
Um and so Savvy Social is ingrained into what I do. However, I'm going through a bit of a rebrand with my positioning. You mentioned kind of like my new tagline, finding the sweet spot between the soft life and hustling. And that's really been my mission the whole time. I'm just putting a new name on it to make people instantly connect with that messaging. Also, I talk a lot about other things. This podcast, for example, I talk a lot about podcasting. I think podcasting and email are technically more impactful to my business than social media,
Mhm.
but I teach social media. And so part of this is like I'm teaching social media to be like, "Oh, I lead people to my podcast." That's really the big thing for me,
Mhm.
right? And so the rebrand to mindful marketing is all about repositioning it, what I talk about, to not be so focused on social media. So, and this also I do not recommend. I rebranded the podcast 2 weeks after having my second baby, uh, because it just happened to be the, 10-year anniversary of my business as well.
Mm.
So it all kind of came together as, like, I'm celebrating 10 years by going in this new direction. I planned it all out before having the baby, and then my team kind of changed everything while I was recovering. And now we're the Mindful Marketing Podcast, and the feedback was amazing, like, instantly. I still have formerly known as in, like, the title because people still know me as Savvy Social Podcast, and they still look that up. That's what we won awards under that name. Um, but there's so many little things that are connected to Savvy Social, so my recommendation would be pick a name and stick with it. Um, but if you have to
Yeah.
change your name, there's like it's actually really easy to do in the podcast host, really easy to change your name and cover art. It's just like all the other places where you mention your podcast, you gotta go back and change all of those too. But this new direction has opened up the conversation because now I'm able to not just talk about social media, but podcasting and email marketing and like other forms of marketing that actually are more impactful to me and my business outside of social media, which is my area of expertise.
Yeah, and that's so exciting. It's like an evolution of the brand as well, where
Yeah.
you kind of you were more niche before, and then now you open it up. It's a broader topic that you can talk about, which is also really cool. And just for anyone listening, like what we usually say, what we usually teach is to start a podcast as niche as possible, right? As what makes sense within reason. So if you can narrow it down to one topic for one specific group of people, great. Start that and then go broader once you've made that successful and once you've made that work, instead
Yeah.
of starting super broad because it's just really difficult to gain traction that way.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually really interesting to see that it is possible to do that, right? Before you talked about one topic, it's like more niche in marketing, social media, and then now you open it up to more, um, marketing discussions and topics, which is really cool and super exciting for
Yay.
sure.
Thank you. I'm excited about it too because it just it opens up more conversations. Another thing you mentioned at the beginning of the episode was a lot of people don't like social media.
Mhm.
And there's this what I call a situationship that we have with social media where it's like we love it, but then, like, we also hate it at the same time. Like,
Yeah.
it's not a healthy relationship at all.
Yeah.
And so I wanna talk about that, and I brought people on the show who are like, "Yeah, I no longer use social media," and those are the conversations I wanna have. I find it fascinating, like, social media is a great tool. It's a marketing tool, but it's only one tool. You don't have to use social media. What else can you use? Podcast guesting, for instance, a great way to like get in front of new people and talk about what you do. And you don't need social media for that, right? So yeah, this evolution for me is not to be anti-social media because it's still my first love. I love social media and it's still my preference, but also it's not the most impactful thing I can do in my business marketing-wise. So let's talk about that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned that social media is a big source of traffic for your podcast, right? From social media, you send people to your podcast to nurture them further, and then they would, be interested to work with you and then sign up for that. Um, how do you do that exactly? Can you share a little bit more about your process on how to promote the podcast on social media?
Yeah. I like to use a strategy that I call the Costco sample strategy. So when you go to Costco or Sam's Club or wherever you're going, big warehouse style shopping, they give you these little samples, right? Like a little piece of cheese, a little cracker. So you taste it and then you go, I got to buy the whole thing. That's my strategy for the podcast. So I use Riverside and I take little clips from the podcast. They have this like magic tool that lets it like auto selects clips for you. And so I'll usually just pick one of those. I like to trim it down because their clips are kind of long. They're always a minute, and we don't need a whole minute. Sometimes I'll just do 30 seconds, 15 seconds, just enough that's like a concept from the show. And then I'll post that on social media. Almost every platform right now is in love, like obsessed with vertical video. Even LinkedIn is like, yes, vertical video all the way. So, same little vertical video. I post it to all platforms. And then I give a little like, hey, this is the concept from the show. Here's how you listen to it. And a lot of people respond to that. And so that's my main way of sharing the episodes. But I'll also do what I use the thought bubble emoji for this and like my content planning. And it's to me like these little content nuggets from the podcast. So if I were to do one on this episode, for instance, I would do like how to market my business during maternity leave. And I would just share like a few things I did: batch recording, recording when I had energy, reposting guest podcasts. And then I would go something like, but I talk about this way more in this podcast episode, and then
Mhm.
link to that. And sometimes I'll put that like little call to action in the comment section too. So it's like, it's not the main point of the post. I'm still giving you information. I'm still sharing something valuable, but like, if you're kind of curious, I talk about this more on this episode of the podcast. So I'll do that a lot too to drive traffic over to the podcast.
I love that. And I think so okay, backing up. When I started this podcast and when we started working with clients, many people did a post that was, "We have a new podcast episode. Woohoo." That was the post. But what I'm hearing you say is value first, right? The post itself is valuable information. It's a snippet from the podcast where one concept gets explained, or it is a post about that, like maybe it's like bullet points or whatever it is. And then if people want more, they can go to the podcast. But they don't have to because it's still valuable on its own. And that's definitely something that we learned trial and error as well, where it was like, it makes sense if you say it like this, but I think it was so common for people to just do a post on social media that said, yeah, the new episode. That was just the thing everyone did. So I think this is super valuable, very good advice. Value first approach. Make sure that
Yes.
it's worth seeing the post even if people don't go to the podcast because it's also marketing, right? It's not the goal is not necessarily to get people just to your podcast, but also to build that brand, build a relationship with these people. And not everyone is a podcast listener, I think, unfortunately. I
Yeah.
couldn't imagine it, but
I know, right? Everyone should be listening to podcasts, but a lot of people don't. And the interesting thing about the way social media algorithms are changing right now, if I can be just like nerdy for a second, is the algorithms are focused on discovery. So that means they're trying to help people discover new content. They're not so wild about like always showing your content to the people who follow you.
Mhm.
They want to put your content in front of new people. And so I like to design my content as if someone who's never heard of me before is just looking at this post for the first time. And I think that mindset shift can be really helpful to podcasters because it takes you from like, I posted another episode with the assumption that everyone's reading every post and listening to everything that you do, which as much as we'd love that, that's not reality at all. Like
Yeah.
your post is mixed in with hundreds of other posts. So if we just assume someone's never heard of you before and this is the first time they're looking at this, what do you say? And it's values first. It's like, okay, before we even get to like buy this like enormous pack of cheese that you've never heard of before, let's just like give you a little sample first. And
Yeah.
yeah, definitely values first there.
Yeah. I love that. That's such good advice.
Cool.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and sharing about your 6 years of podcasting. I can't believe that you were able to stay consistent for 6 years. That's amazing. And that's over 300 episodes, by the
Yep.
way. In case you're listening and you're wondering, that's a lot of content.
Yep.
So I think that in itself is a huge achievement. But I also loved hearing about the effect that the podcast had on your business, right? That you found new clients, but also sponsors. So it's a different income stream as well, which is super valuable. Um, and I just learned a lot from you today, also on how to use social media to promote our podcasts, but also that it's not the only thing you can do, right? Even as someone who loves social media, I think it's super cool that you are also so real and to say that, you know what, if you don't like social media, you don't have to be on social media if you don't want to. It's just what it's a choice, right? It's one of many things that you could do to get in front of new audiences. I think that's super good advice as well. So before I let you go, can you share where people can find you and the podcast?
Yes. So you can just search Mindful Marketing Podcast on any podcasting app. We're everywhere. And my website is onlinedrea.com. I have lots of like goodies on there that are free. My favorite one right now is our social media reset challenge. So if you're feeling like this toxic relationship with social media, my favorite thing to do is switch that into like, let's be in a healthy, loving relationship with social media. So that's what the reset challenge is. It's 7 days of, sorry, seven, it's 5 days of videos and accompanying homework and journaling prompts to help you figure out how to have a healthy relationship with social media. So that's on my website as well, onlinedrea.com.
Perfect. We'll also link that in the show notes and we'll also link the challenge because that sounds really good. Yeah, it sounds super valuable as well. Maria, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was really, really lovely talking to you today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, that's it for today's episode. Need some help to get your podcast off the ground? Not sure where to start and what to focus on? Go to thepodcastbabes.com to schedule a call and learn more about our podcast launch and production services. See you next week.